Thanks everyone for being here today with us on this panel regarding how to overcome the valley of death. Really looking forward to getting a discussion going and really figuring out how we can get more of these longevity interventions from the lab into the hands of consumers and getting everyone to live longer and healthier lives. Today with us here today, we have 4 panelists that are experts in their own subdiscipline with the longevity space. So I'll go ahead and briefly introduce them, and then we'll go ahead and get into the debate discussion portion of the session. So our first panelist we have is Sergio Ruiz. He is a managing director of the Methuselah Fund and chief operating officer for Stanford-born company called Repair Biotechnologies, focusing on epigenetic resetting of the age in a cell. Second panelist on board is Patrick Burgermeister. He's a double background in molecular biology and finance and is a partner at Kizoo Technology Capital and investor in regenerative medicine companies. Third on our list is Reason. He's director of aging research website Fighting Aging. Reason is also the founder of Repair Biotechnologies, a biotech startup focused on the development of therapies relevant to human rejuvenation. And finally, we have Dr. Ronjon, an inventor, entrepreneur, and founder of the R42 Institute, through which he invents, informs, and invests in longevity space. He's also founder and advisor / board member of multiple startups. His companies have been sold to Apple, BlackBerry, Motorola, and more. Welcome to all of our panelists. I guess I'll go ahead and start with sort of the first question to kick off the discussion here. And I really want to get your guys' takes on, at least all of you guys function to some capacity as an investor in the longevity space. And I want to get your take on, from an investor perspective, are there any specific milestones that you think longevity companies should aim to reach before asking for investor capital? And what are those milestones that companies should be thinking about before going to investors and asking for that private capital and doing so successfully? Anyone go ahead.
Well, if I guess I'll start on the grounds that I'm usually the guy talking around anywhere that has me. So I think the thing that really, the first thing you should ask yourself is, do you have a mechanism or do you have a candidate therapy? If your next step is, I need to go do a small molecule screen to find myself a candidate, then you should probably not be talking to investors. You should be writing grant proposals. Because if you go to an investor and it turns out that, hey, I need to go do a small molecule screen, that isn't going to go over so well. So I think it's some balance of data that shows you have a thing that can do a thing, not just that you know that something should be done. So you need either a candidate drug, and preferably you need at least pretty comprehensive data in vitro that drug does something, drug candidate does something, or some very flashy animal data and less comprehensive in vitro data. One of those two things. There are companies in the space that are all across the board here, but I think you'll find no company that actually is just focused on a mechanism but doesn't yet have a candidate to influence that mechanism.
I'll chime in for a second. I think that's on the therapeutic side. I think there are probably a couple of differences. One is there could be other technologies for longevity, wearables of various things and things like that, that maybe you need less sort of evidence. The second component is maybe if you've got sort of a rounded out team where you're betting on the team members and the team member intuition, the valuation is going to be lower. There are a set of investors that will take an earlier bet, but it will be a lower valuation, and so you'll have to give up more. But I think, as Reason said, you still nevertheless have to give some kind of justification, even if it's an intuition thing. Even if you've got a Nobel Prize and it's your intuition, you'd still have to give some kind of indication why you think that.
I would like to also add a couple of things. Every investor is very different. For us at the Methuselah Fund, we're looking to invest in companies that could have additional revenue or forms of money coming in within 18 months. I know this is all hypothetical. Nobody can predict the future, but how do we assess this? So independent investment, so being able to raise more money beyond our value, our investment, and to do so from different set of investors. We also like different kinds of income coming from licensing deals, pharma deals, be a company that knows how to get grants, like Ruiz said, somebody who, a company that's able to put together in paper and get non-dilutive forms of funding. And ideally, and this is really hard for a lot of longevity companies, and working on longevity therapeutics will be getting customer sales. So I think this will be more in the companies that Ronjon was mentioning before, companies that have maybe wearables that help us understand longevity and enhance functional longevity in a way. We also look for platform technologies. So I would say, before you even go and ask for money, see how can your company pivot into different scenarios. The one key thing about longevity is that you can't go to the FDA and say, here we're solving longevity. You have to be able to have a platform that is able to tackle different indications as the regulatory environment gets better. So as a company that's able to go forward with a product in today's regulatory environment. So those are kind of the different things that we're focusing on before we go ahead and invest in a company.
Okay, my answer is maybe a little bit different. We are a hardcore drug development investor. So we can take the 10 years or so that it takes to develop a drug. So we're less oriented towards early revenue or licensing income. It depends, as the other panelists have said, on who do you approach. If it's a very early round, an angel investor, there are very few things that you need to have, but you should have them ticked. You should have the company incorporated, I think. Not the attitude that we will start a company if you give us money. So we'd like to see some skin in the game. Also, a license agreement that is established already would be helpful, so that you do not need to say, yeah, we'll see what terms we get, and they're very favorable, and we are in good talks. This should be finished if possible. And since we're today talking about longevity investments, I think it's very crucial to have early regulatory input. Aging is not a disease, it's not classified as such, so you should have a surrogate indication, and you should know how to tackle this. I think this is a very crucial point. The other things, having data, in vitro, animal data is even better, are more or less self-explanatory, but regulatory input is not.
I think that was a good point about the getting the licensing nailed down. Certainly, it's possible to go out and raise, early friends and family, sort of very seed round stuff before you've done that, since you have to find the $50,000 to spend on lawyers from somewhere. But yeah, getting the licensing done, your earnest investors who want to put a few million into the company as a seed round, at that stage, you certainly should have your licensing agreement agreed for your core IP.
And I would add also, it does really help if there's some kind of paper out there that's peer reviewed about your own technology, so that we're able to assess it as a community and to see how the community reacts to it. So those are pluses when it comes down to investing.
Cool. So it seems that everyone has a little bit of a different take on this. So there isn't sort of like that one concrete milestone that a company needs to reach. But perhaps maybe we can look at it from the other angle, what you shouldn't do. And I would like to maybe understand from an investor perspective, sometimes companies don't really have an idea of why an investor says no, or why they're ignoring my emails, et cetera, et cetera. So can you maybe tell us a little bit more about why you don't invest in companies, why that no decision is made, and maybe sort of those common pitfalls that that companies or entrepreneurs might make that are not sort of like milestone related, but maybe presentation skills, maybe it could be sort of some IP is not figured out, et cetera. What are those other sort of pitfalls that companies might fall into that are reasons give you reason for not investing in them?
Yeah, so
maybe I go here first because I've been investing in early stage companies since 2006 and only recently switched to the longevity field. So I've been a conventional VC, if you will, for a long, long time. And there are two things that strike me very much. First is maybe the team. This is a very early and fledgling field. So often you see teams, in contrast to other drug development endeavors, that have no experience yet in drug development. It's researchers that are very excited about their project. And you're right, Javier. We investors, we often hide behind the reasons why we don't invest. And you need to have an investor that is very direct to tell you it's the team, it's you. You know, you will hear that very seldom, but it can be the case, you know, that you just think they need to have other people. If this investor is half polite, he will say, I think you have gaps in the knowledge that you need, but often this is not said. The second point that strikes me to my early experience in VC is the valuation. I'm very used to the valuation being determined by the investors that come in. They look at the opportunity, they analyze it, they do a thorough due diligence, and then they say, we agree this should be X valuation. Very often now, since I'm 1.5 years now in the longevity field, it's like a price tag, it's already there. And often angel investors even ask, oh, by the way, what's the valuation? I'm not sure whether this is really helpful because this panel is about bridging the value of death. And if you just try to maximize valuation early on, it's maybe bridging to nowhere, because at some point in time, you have to go to the big guys, to the conventional VCs. If you need to finance a phase 1B, 2A trial, then you need the big money. And if your valuation is already sky high, it will be tough to continue the journey.
Yeah, let me comment. Yes, I mean, having been in the valley of death myself, I mean, this is the topic is the valley of death. Maybe we should just define that a little bit. That's basically when no one will give you any money and you don't have very much money to continue. Right. And so you're pitching investors, and what's why do I not invest sometimes? I echo what Patrick's saying exactly, is that in the end, it's not the company that sets the valuation, it's the marketplace that sets it. And if there's a mismatch, then it can delay it. And I've been there myself. It's very emotional that, if you raise money at a large valuation, a year before and now you just can't get the same, you have to be lower. It's nothing personal. It's not you, it's the marketplace. And so you've really got to match where you're at with what the market's saying. If you look at 2002, you had like $100 million valuations, and the next, 6 months later, they're back down to $10 million valuation. It wasn't because you were not worth 100. At that time, everybody was worth 10 times more than they should have been in the public markets. It's the market changes. The second point is why I turn down people. If I do not understand the message, I do not understand their story, I don't think I'm particularly unsophisticated, but if I can't understand it, then other people won't be able to understand it either. And that's a financing risk. And so you really have to get the story right. The third thing is, are the people committed? I see this very much in academic kind of groups. And I say, the academic inventor. So, well, if this is so good, are you going to leave your academic job, sell your house and all its contents to go and do this, right? And often the answer is no. They will want to stay in their job and say, well, why not? Right? Don't you want to be a millionaire? Don't you want to be a billionaire? So it's like evidence-based. And so I'm looking at these things, but I'll stop there and let other people comment as well.
I think the point about valuation is interesting. I mean, to a certain extent, your pressure as an entrepreneur is that you want to have a high enough valuation to be able to raise the money you need to get to the next milestone. without doing something that looks bad to investors, like overly diluting at a given round, because investors are going to be just as unhappy if you raised at a low valuation as if you raised at something, you're trying to raise at something too high. It's a weird sort of dance, and everybody sort of fumbles around it initially. And I think that it's a very large part of the learning curve for people who are coming from something other than being an entrepreneur before, or an investor before in this industry, that you have to learn the dance as it's danced in this particular industry and time. And scientists are uniquely, humorously bad at this. It's definitely a learning curve for them. Beyond that, I interact with a lot of people as an advocate, and just, you know, out there looking for new sources of funding. Interact with a lot of people who are not in the biotech investment space per se, but sort of have discovered that, wow, there's this thing going on over there. Maybe we should pay some attention. And I see the chief reasons that people don't invest, from my perspective, is one, they don't understand. And they understand that they don't understand, and they don't want to have anything to do with things that they don't understand, because they can't evaluate risk properly. And it's rather interesting, Ronjon, that your position on understanding is more, do you think other people will understand? Because it's a risk to get further investment, rather than okay, I don't understand, I'm not doing this. And secondly, there's an aversion to biotech. I think, like, we're obviously in a pool where that's not a thing. We're very into biotech, but out there in the broader market, there is a real aversion to biotech. People perceive it as this thing that doesn't give you returns very quickly, and is some sort of magical, horrible, money-consuming machine where somehow somebody gets rich somewhere, but it usually isn't you. Right? And that I think is something that needs to be overcome through general education. And it's a bootstrapping process for the investor community, not just for the entrepreneur community. And I'll halt at that point and let somebody else comment.
Yeah, I would add to this that we try our best to say, or to tell the companies why we don't invest in them. Many times the companies go ahead and pivot, and they follow a direction that that we've suggested. Maybe we see that there's a path that has least resistance or is more attractive, and then they get a little bit more traction, and then we're able to invest, or at least they're able to get the round ready. But I always try to, so put in my entrepreneur hat, I always try to get to the source of why is it that somebody didn't invest in a company that I'm a part of. And it's often, I think, Reason and Ronjon were quite specific. It's understanding. And they're very open about that. There are other investors out there, and that's the thing. No two investors are alike. They're not even in the same wavelength sometimes of understanding. And just because a team of investors has a lot of knowledge and education doesn't mean they're going to understand what you're trying to tell them. I mean, we live in a disruptive industry, things that weren't there just 20 years ago or even 2 years ago, and now you're trying to tell the world, hey, we just created microprocessors, right? What is that? The world is made up of mainframe. So it's really interesting that sometimes, and I think it comes down to that point, is just they don't it's too new. It's too new, and they want to wait until a Series A. And that's usually what a lot of investors in the space that are not necessarily longevity focused, but are really interested in being a part of it, they're always waiting until Series A. And they say, come back to us when you're in Series A. We're happy to write that $5 million check and even lead. So the question is, do they have an understanding that the industry will grow to where we see it growing? You could say that they don't. They can't really compare it. There's a couple of companies that have already gone public, and some of them have just become cancer companies instead of maintaining a longevity focus. And some others, they're not doing too well with the clinical trials for one reason or another. That's a whole nother topic. So the question is, why is it that you don't invest? If you as a company are able to get them to say something to you specific, then you can address it. Sometimes they'll say, well, there's not much safety data. Sometimes they say, well, we need a much better regulatory path. So every single investor has different pain points, but I would just say be persistent as to how you communicate. Try to have another face-to-face via Zoom, during these times, so you can extract that information. Don't just rely after the first conversation on email, because email, it just condenses and compresses information in a way that is not conducive to learning. And that's what we want to do and help our companies in the valley of death, is to learn how to get above that valley of death.
I'd like to comment one thing. There's different stages of investors. So some investors will, by definition, will only invest at the late stage, and each investor class thinks it's a mugs game, to invest at the angel level, and the angels say it's a mugs game to invest at the mezzanine level. Turns out they're all right. So when you're pitching, you've got to say, who is this person? The other difference in longevity biotech compared to, let's say, e-commerce or a regular tech, which is more of an execution market-based system. The laws of biology are much more ephemeral than the laws of physics. And so as a result, you're going to take a lot more diversification strategy in biotech than you are in, it's always diversification in high risk thing, but particularly in biotech, because we know that pre-phase 1 is a 5% chance of getting to the end. So you could be the cleverest person in the Nobel Prize winner, you still only have a 5% chance of getting to commercial viability. So you need to have multiple bets. If you're just doing, this is my favorite company, and just do one, the odds are against you. And so I think investing is going to be different. And so when you're trying to match, it says, do I fit this guy's diversification plan? Does he already have a play in pancreatic cancer or what have you? Do I fit in somewhere different? I'll stop there so Sergio can ask more questions. Oh, Javier can ask more questions.
Yeah. So one of the things I saw a lot of you guys mention was sort of this aspect of the investor not understanding the company and hence not being able to get that conviction to invest, right? And this is actually something that I talked in my previous talk with Longevity Impact Fund. We're trying to create some investor education to be able to overcome this conviction hurdle that we see within the angel investment space that can be sort of a bridge to solve that valley of death gap towards the venture capital world. And so I guess I would pose that question back to you. If this sort of investor education, because longevity space is a very technical space, a difficult space to sort of get into if you don't come from that kind of academic, scientific background, how do we educate investors? How to create an ecosystem within longevity space that promotes investors overcoming that conviction gap, right? Do you guys have any thoughts on how we can do that as an ecosystem and improve that opportunity for longevity companies to cross that valley of death from that perspective?
I'm often having conversations. So your question is, how do we educate our colleagues so they can? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
How do we overcome that conviction gap, that knowledge gap that exists? It seems to be a common theme of why investors are not able to sort of have that conviction to invest.
Oh, so, well, we go out there and we make stupendous amounts of money as investors. I mean, that solves the whole problem if we do that enough times to get in the papers, right?
Yeah, I think Reason's Fight Agent has been fantastic. I think Leaf has done a great job. The Methuselah Foundation also. I've often been able to talk to a lot of VCs who are trying to understand longevity. And one of the problems that we have is that there's the academic component and there's the business component. Different people, even in the audience, have different strategies for beating, ending, and doing aging, right? So how do you put that into a formula for a VC? How do you quantify this so that the VCs can tell their LPs, look, we're maximizing this path towards anti-aging and you get money and then you get youth? It's really hard. And at the end of the day, you have things like health tech, you have things like age tech, and now you have longevity biotech. So trying to understand, and then that's a sub niche of the big biotech, trying to understand where this all lies really sets as expectations. And I try not to give my own personal opinion when I talk to other investors about how we're all going to get to live 100 healthy years of life, and then eventually 150, and then we grow from there if we can. I just try to tell them, these are the different theories. These are the possible reasons why we age. And this is why we think, financially speaking, makes sense to back these things. We're talking about, like Sergey Young said earlier today, trillion, I think multi-trillion-dollar companies being made out of this. So it's just addressing less the academic, figuring out the theory and the 9 hallmarks of aging. I mean, we can deep dive into that, but I think that's a second, third date with those colleagues. But initially, just focusing on the potential of the markets.
Yeah, any other thoughts?
I think that, again, it's sort of like on the higher order bit, like Reason says, look, if you're making money, then there's a certain point, and this is probably later stage companies, where the understanding is not as necessary. You're making money, so I really don't care what you're doing. You're just the numbers are the numbers, and you're making money. In this field, you don't actually have to make money. If you get to a phase 2, we're much more IP centric. Companies can go public with no revenues and relatively few people compared to tech companies, because they say, well, where are you in your phase if it's a drug? That's less the case on the devices side. But can you, if you've got to a phase 2, then you have a 35% chance of getting to the end. So that the odds are now moving towards your favor, where big pharma will say, let's try and now it's worth the bet. I think that in the really early stages, the understanding, we really basically have to say, well, if you make this progress, can the market segment be big enough? In the end, now money makes the world go round, and people need to see a line of sight to actually exit. I don't think you need to wait 15 years, because there's these intermediate points where the companies or the technologies have value. And that's probably part of the understanding that we have to sort of educate people about. It's different to regular e-commerce type things.
Right. So I think that goes back towards that investor education to some extent. A lot of investors who enter the ecosystem don't realize that within longevity or other biotech spaces, there are earlier exit opportunities versus traditional IPO or acquisition. But it takes someone sort of introducing them to that world so that they can understand that concept as a new way of investing. And that's just a little bit of my take on that. And I think one other thing that maybe we haven't mentioned is also about sort of the value add that working in a syndicate format can bring. So a lot of sort of angel investors who are coming into the space or general investors may not have sort of that initial conviction, but if they're able to work with other investors sort of in a collaborative environment, that seems to be a potential avenue that I think we need to explore a bit more and see if that helps sort of bridge that knowledge gap. But that's just sort of my take. Let's hop on to another question here. So I guess something that I found quite interesting in a previous talk was the talk a little bit about mission-driven investments. What do you guys think about the concept of mission-driven investments as a tool or a mechanism to be able to bridge this valley of death? Whereas instead of purely profit-seeking, we create these sort of fund structures or other mechanisms to deploy capital that are more mission-driven than purely just profit-seeking. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think there's been a lot of thinking about that in recent years. You can look at Michael Greaves' operation, and I'm sure that our fellow panelists can talk about that as a way to cultivate the high expectation value startups that you want to invest in. And frankly, if you have a field in which there's a bunch of stuff out there just under the waterline of readiness, then take 10% of your fund and go do something to make them ready, and then you get a great crop of potential deals that nobody else has access to because you created them. And certainly a lot of funds operate on this principle more or less. Certainly Apollo did that sort of thing, and James Payer's new fund is very focused on creating companies rather than waiting for them to turn up. And I think it's all about, you know, to what degree you go do that. How much are you willing to go create companies?
I think that's
thanks for that remark.
Go ahead, Pat.
Because you mentioned Michael Greve. What we often discuss together is that we really want to open completely new categories of treatments. You know, like for example, the senolytics, which we consider sometimes even as already mature. Maybe they don't need another push. So we're already looking behind that. What could be the next mission that we could support? The next wave that we could start. It could be reprogramming. It could be age breakers and other things. Maybe categories that others do not touch. And I think that is very valuable in this field in the terms of mission-driven investments. Sergio, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no. I would add that it's really important for investors that are in this space right now to help the companies address the value of death, honestly. And the way we approach sometimes, so at the Methuselah Fund, we are mission driven because we believe that the mission will bring about the financial success. Some people think mission driven is, you know, taking a company, going to the FDA, knocking on their doors and saying, hey, make agent an indication. You know, that's not true. It just comes down to the culture that we're creating. It comes down to, if we're going to take an indication and prove the platform, prove the technology, making sure that we still maintain our agent experiments, making sure we still maintain our personality as a company focused on longevity, being okay with, like you mentioned, Javier, making a deal with a big pharma and selling off the indication, because that's a means to an end. So those are the kind of things that we're focused on. I think the value of death, it's really going to be, there's going to be a big bridge put on there by angel investors that want to live longer, that have made a lot of money in other areas, and they just need more time to enjoy it. So that's why we have been focusing on mission-oriented individuals. The Methuselah Fund LPs are mission-oriented individuals, and they can afford to lose this kind of, or to make this kind of risky investments, potentially lose some money, because at the end of the day, they want to see the results. And as they're coming out of the valley of death, we make the companies, we put in the executives around it, the people that know how to develop the drug components and everything, and then we make them ready to be attractive to the VCs, to the CVCs, and to other kind of potential investors that are more professional and expect different standards. So it's really just a coordinated effort to get out of that gravity well that's the value of death.
So let me comment a little bit. So there's a couple of questions on the chat about how do you reduce risk. The value of death, I think for companies it's tough and it needs counseling of people, and often people who've been there themselves, not panic, and you have to do what you have to do. If you have to cut costs, you have to cut costs. You know, these are often painful things that entrepreneurs are loath to do. So it's having people who've been in that position to say, look, it's okay, you have to do it. It's not a personal issue on you. The other aspect, if nothing else, from my message in this conversation, is diversification is key. You can get from the investor side, the value of death is not necessarily a bad investment opportunity. Often these companies and projects have gone quite far, and there's been, for whatever reason, it could be an economic environment, it could be a pandemic, it could be lots of things that happen where the financing is all of a sudden restricted, or your story is not quite the right time, right place. These are actually good investments for investors, because a lot of the risk has been taken out and there's not many other investments you want to bet in, but you still need to diversify. There's a comment about Unity, their phase 2 trials didn't work well, so their stock dropped. If you bet on one, it won't work. So betting on a fund is not a bad idea. So can you bet on 20 ideas? Because unlike some of the other engineering projects, you still won't be able to bet on the right one if it's just one. You really do have to have more to be able to take the ups and downs of the different vehicles. I think that's my basic message.
So I'd like to get to some of the audience questions, but I have one last question before we get there, if we have any time. So we talk a lot about sort of the investment side of the landscape, VC world, angel investment world, but I was wondering what your opinion is on sort of the more federal funds, university ecosystem side of things. What can this side of the ecosystem do to get companies, research scientists that are becoming entrepreneurs more ready to go and pitch these ideas, develop these ideas to fruition to the point where they're ready to actually receive capital from investors? What do you think we can do more on that side of the equation in the longevity space?
Well, I mean, the public side of things is perpetually irredeemable. There's no sense in trying to do anything there because it will always be subverted by the people who feed at the trough. The universities might be salvageable. I mean, where salvageable would mean you have a flat licensing fee for everything, no negotiation. It's well known, it's well published. You don't spend 6 months doing a tech transfer agreement. You just decide whether or not you can suck up the flat fee that everybody pays. And they should cut 90% of their administration to pay for like actually doing more stuff that matters. But you know, these are things that are unlikely to happen as well. But really, I think the universities are fat, bloated toads that sit atop the road to progress and prevent people going past for no good reason. And they definitely are a big slowdown on getting things done.
So I agree with what you said, reason to a large part, but I will say that there are some universities doing some new things on these licensing agreements. For example, some universities have put in place standard license agreements for licensing out technologies, and they don't do any negotiating. So this is a standard sort of licensing percentage fee that they do, and it's meant to sort of promote that licensing of technologies because there isn't that negotiating period that takes forever. They aren't trying to bargain extra capital from the entrepreneurs. So there is a little bit of innovation happening there. It's just a matter of standardizing that across the university system. But that's just on that point. I'll let others add more on that.
I had a concrete example a couple of years ago where a university was very open to out-license technology to help companies start. And then an exit happened and money came back. And suddenly they got very greedy. And the next companies that tried to get a license from them suddenly faced very tough conditions that sometimes even prevented them from getting money elsewhere. So success can be a two-edged sword here. And the technology office that was there, that was not really helpful afterwards.
The technology offices don't have much of an incentive to do anything. That's the problem. I mean, you remind me that I've actually been talking to a German university's technology transfer office for something approaching 6 months now, I think, and they are simply disinterested in any sort of licensing of the technology they hold on to. They just don't want to do it. It's right. Very interesting.
Maybe a remark on that. Sometimes it helps if you bypass them. If you go not to the TTO, but directly to the research heads, to the group leaders in the lab. I've experienced that some of them just block you, technology transfer offices. But if you speak to the researchers, they say, no, we're interested. We'd like to start a company. So sometimes it's really people specific, and yeah.
Absolutely. You have several leverages there, and one of them is the inventors, because they also get a royalty. So you really have to get them on board. If they're not going to be part of your company, you have to come in, show them the vision, and say, this is going to be fantastic. And now I need you to pressure the OTT, Office of Transfer and Technology, in a very kind way. Take him out to coffee and say, hey, listen, I really want to have my invention taken to the clinic by these guys. Is there anything that we can do? That has been a really successful approach. And I agree with Patrick. I think things take longer when there is no relationship between the inventor and the Office of Technology Transfer. So if we have some academics in the audience and you already don't know somebody in your Office of Technology Transfer, then you really need to start doing that. It's going to help the universities. is going to help the technology to go forward is just a must to do. And I think that part of education sometimes is lacking on the academic sense of things.
Okay, let's get to a little bit of the audience questions. I'm scrolling up here. We have a lot of questions actually. One here, how would you suggest to change the perception of investing into biotech as a bad idea? Reason is right about that. Fewer people would invest in biotech than they say in tech companies, let alone longevity companies. It's too risky. So I guess, how would you suggest to change the perception of investing into biotech as a bad idea?
Make a lot of money doing it.
Yeah, I think I mean, even my own investments have been done very, very well. You just put your poster childs up. You know, there's many good biotech investors, and on the one side, on the flip side, unlike tech, we actually don't have to have any revenues. People will value it on an IP basis only, which is debatably easier or harder, of course. But there've been many examples where people have done well. You just put that down.
Of course, you do have the time problem. I've been a biotech investor since 2016, and we still don't know whether I'm a good biotech investor or a bad biotech investor, right?
It takes 10 years. It takes 10 years to know.
We'll hop on to another question here, probably the last one before we run out of time. How do you stand on investing in startups that build the picks and shovels, e.g. platforms for the industry, versus startups working directly on curing aging? What are the pros and cons?
I like that. I like that idea, because as we are building an industry, we need to build, I always liken it to a big wave, right? We know longevity is, we're going to have a breakthrough, but we need to have a surfboard and to be able to navigate it. Delivery companies are so important at this point. Companies that focus on raw material. You probably heard of Elon Musk's new venture there, trying to create more mRNA and such. Making sure that all these tools are available. It's what I think firms call, the structural investments. Firms like Longevity Vision Fund, they're focused a lot on investments like this. Helping create an ecosystem that makes everybody else thrive. I do think there's a place for this kind of investments.
I think you have to do both. I mean, obviously, infrastructure is what makes the world turn, but sometimes you have to apply it as well. I mean, personally, I chose not to invest in infrastructure companies just to try to cut down things to a manageable chunk. But if you're a fund, then obviously you want to do both. They both have to happen.
Awesome. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up here because we're coming up short on time. I'd like to thank our panelists for attending and giving us their insight. For those of you in the audience, maybe those of you that don't know, at Lifespan, we do run the Longevity Investor Network. So that might be an initiative to check out to see if you want to get involved in the longevity space. If you do, feel free to reach out to me or someone else at Lifespan, and we'll get you up to speed with what we're doing with the Longevity Investor Network initiative.